Hello everyone. You might be surprised by my background right now. This is my backyard. I typically work on videos in my garage. That's where my little office area is set up, and I wanted to get outside and get some sunlight. The discussion that I've got for you is between Dr. Békefi and Dr. Brian Cutter. They are going to be discussing the ensoulment hypothesis. Dr. Cutter defends the ensoulment hypothesis, and Dr. Békefi tries to poke holes in his arguments. This discussion that you're going to hear is actually based on a pair of papers that these two have written on this topic. So Dr. Cutter wrote a paper defending the AI ensoulment hypothesis, and it was published in Faith and Philosophy. And I actually recorded an interview with him on that paper several months ago. It will be linked in the description of this video. But since the recording of that video, Dr. Békefi wrote a paper in response to Dr. Cutter. And so I just decided I'd bring him on and let him have a discussion with Dr. Cutter. And it was a really good one. Unfortunately, near the very end of the interview, Dr. Békefi's video cut out, and I did not realize that at the end of the recording. So there's about 10 minutes at the very end that I had to delete. I hate that I had to do that, but I just could not recover the file. That is the first time that's happened to me like that, so I apologize for that. But there's still a lot of good stuff in the 40-minute discussion that I was able to salvage. So buckle up, this is a good one. Before I get started, I did want to say one thing, a little life update. So several weeks ago, about probably 4 or 5 weeks ago, my wife lost her job. It was very unexpected, and that's put us in a bit of a financial strain. If you are somebody that has benefited from my videos for quite a while, been watching my content for a while, and maybe you've not signed up to be a patron, I would greatly appreciate if you would consider that at this time, at least for the next few months, while she's trying to find another stable job, and we're also trying to find a place for my 2-year-old son to attend a daycare or a preschool of some kind. Right now it's been difficult for her to find a job and difficult to find him a place to be put into school so that she can work. So I'd really appreciate if you would consider becoming a patron. The link to become a patron is in the description of this video. All right, without further ado, let's jump into the discussion. Dr. Cutter, I want to turn things over to you first. What is the AI ensoulment hypothesis, and why do you think we should have a middling credence in the AI ensoulment hypothesis?
Yeah, so the AI ensoulment hypothesis, we'll call this the hypothesis that some future AI systems will be endowed with immaterial souls. And immaterial here, very roughly, is some kind of immaterial, concrete thing that is in some way the basis or the fundamental bearer of certain mental properties or capacities like consciousness, thought, rationality, so forth. And so I've got this paper that I think recently came out in Faith and Philosophy, where I argue that we should at least take the AI ensoulment hypothesis seriously. My attitude is kind of middling agnosticism about it. A paper, not because I think that future AIs will be ensouled, but just because I think a possibility that a lot of people miss, a lot of people who otherwise believe in immaterial souls are dismissive of, and I thought that dismissal was unjustified. So I give a couple arguments for why this should be a hypothesis that's at least on the table. Just to clarify what the claim is. So the claim specifically is that we should take seriously the AI ensoulment hypothesis conditional on two assumptions. One is that substance dualism is true in the human case. So that is humans have immaterial souls. Second is that we will eventually create AGI, by which some AI system that meets at least the kind of functional and behavioral general intelligence can perform the full range of cognitive tasks at or above the human level, roughly speaking. I assume in particular that the AGI we create will be at least at some abstract level of description, functionally analogous to human beings. There might be many differences in detail. So the thought is on these two assumptions that we will one day create AGI and that substance dualism is true in the human case, we should at least take seriously the AI hypothesis. So I give two arguments for this. One I call the analogy argument. The other is the fitting recipient argument. The basic idea of the alien analogy argument is this. Suppose we encountered seemingly intelligent aliens on another planet. So, maybe they have language, they have a complex civilization and economy, they have art and culture and so forth. And moreover, suppose we dissect some of these aliens and we find that they've got a central nervous system that processes information in ways that are at least loosely analogous to the patterns of information processing within the human brain. But we also find that their low level biochemistry, the kind of like material substrate that realizes their nervous system, is very different from ours. It's made of some kind of like weird non-carbon based green goo. It's not like the kind of carbon based biochemistry we find on Earth. So basically, what we have are these creatures that are functionally at an abstract level and behaviorally pretty similar to human beings. But in terms of like low level material constitution, very different. So my claim is we encountered these aliens, then assuming that we have souls, we should at least be moderately confident that they have souls as well. I think most people find this pretty intuitive. And then the same, which I think is the more controversial premise of this, is that if we should be at least moderately confident that these hypothetical aliens have souls, then we should be at least moderately confident that relevantly functional like AI would have souls. The reason for that is just that the cases are closely analogous. In both cases, we have things that are at an abstract functional and behavioral level, relevantly like human beings, but differ from human beings in terms of low-level material constitution. So it's at least hard prima facie to see like why we should treat the two cases differently. That's the gist of the alien analogy argument. The fitting recipient argument, I'll just go through very quickly. The thought is it's at least a reasonable conjecture that physical systems leave immaterial souls when they are recipients of material souls, by which I mean they're kind of in such a way that their physical operations can meaningfully cooperate with the operations of the soul. And thought is whether a system is fit to receive a soul in that sense is purely a matter of its functional and behavioral capacities. And therefore, it doesn't have much to do with the kind of like low level material implementation of those functional and behavioral capacities. Therefore, given this, what I take to be at least somewhat reasonable conjecture about a kind of nomologically sufficient condition for ensoulment, we should conclude that a relevantly functionally human-like AI system would receive a soul. That's the basic idea.
Great. And for the viewers that think, whoa, that's a lot really fast, I've actually done an independent interview from this video with just Dr. Cutter where I think we spent maybe 40 minutes, something like that, unpacking the paper in greater detail. So you can always go and check that out. I'm hosting this discussion today because my other guest, Balint, has written a response to Dr. Cutter's paper, and I wanted to just host a discussion between the two. So, Balint, it might be you launch into any particular objection just to give the viewer a sense of maybe what you agree and what you don't agree with. So, overall, the big conclusion that Dr. Cutter gave was that we should have this middling credence in the AI ensoulment hypothesis. And it might help if you say, that's what I don't think we should have a middling credence in that. And then from there, like which assumptions you would disagree with or which of the arguments have objection.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you for having me. So I'm also a substance dualist. I also think this is a very legitimate question to think about the status of AGI in these terms. But as I've reflected on this stuff, I've come to believe that machines are different enough from humans and animals in general that belief in substance dualism in the human case and in the higher animals doesn't give us good reason to think that AGI would be ensouled. That's the big picture, and then I have specific objections to Brian's arguments.
Okay, so you would agree with the substance dualist assumption you'll probably disagree with the AGI assumption that at some point in the future we'll have AGI.
I mean, I think we will have AI that is typically indistinguishable from humans. I very much doubt that it will implement thought or intelligence the same way that humans do.
Okay. So you're not necessarily going for either of the assumptions. So then the other parts of the argument are going to be the alien analogy argument and the fitting recipient argument. So which of those two are you wanting to target today?
I think we should start, at any rate, with the fitting recipient argument. Because if my objection works there, it will work for the alien analogy argument as well. And so I just started trying to imagine what this would work like. Like, suppose AGI ensoulment happens, and then suppose I start AGI.exe, the software on my computer, and now it has all the functional capacities characterizing human intelligence. And then it's supposed to be ensouled, right? Or at least with mirroring credence, that's the story. And then I started thinking, okay, there's so many things we can do with the computer running a piece of software. We can stop it, we can copy it to another computer, we can run it on both computers, move it around, run it in the cloud, which means it's distributed all over the globe. And then it's supposed to be true that somehow there's a soul there that's tracking all of this in a way that makes the machine a fitting recipient for the soul. And that, I think, is worrisome. So the crucial point, I think, here is being a fitting recipient is kind of a normative or an evaluative notion. It's supposed to make sense or be useful for the soul to become united to such a physical system. But I think the problem there is machines or computers are purposefully designed so that their hardware and their software are very easily decoupled. I mean, we change what software is running on our hardwares all the time. And that means interacting with the hardware is not a reliable way to gain access to the software's functional capacities. That's my main problem. So I think I introduced this additional condition beyond the functional similarity that Brian gives, and I call this additional condition integrity, which just means a physical system has integrity if its physical organization and functional capacities are difficult to decouple. And I think that's very characteristic of biological nervous systems. We don't really have a hardware-software distinction, and it's very uncharacteristic of computers and machines. So that's really the gist of my objection to the fitting recipient argument.
Okay, we need to add this additional condition for what would make something a fitting recipient, and that additional condition is integrity. And by integrity, you mean it would be difficult to decouple the kind of hardware and software distinction. Okay.
So I take the point, we've got this piece of software. You could make some copies of it, run it on different systems, tweak it in various ways. And so like one issue that comes up here is that you get really weird, gnarly personal identity conundrums. So, I run agi.exe, and then I, let's say, make a copy of it and transfer that onto another piece of hardware, and I run them both. And you can ask, which one is supposing the initial computer received a soul, and then I make a copy of it and put it on another piece of hardware. The soul kind of travel with it to the other piece of hardware and now interact with that, or does it stay with the original? Or maybe we destroy the original and send it to two new pieces of hardware. And so granted, there are going to be questions of personal identity. Maybe the one soul travels to one of the two at the expense of the other, and then maybe it looks arbitrary which one it goes to, or maybe it dies and two new souls come into being when we have these fission cases. There are certainly questions. Is that the gist of what makes it unfitting, that you would create these awkward personal identity scenarios where we wouldn't know what to say about where the soul goes or whether personal identity holds?
I mean, that's one aspect of it. Another aspect is, imagine you're the soul, and without any consent on your part, you just get dragged around into various computers. that I take it that embodiment is good for the soul because it allows it to be like present and active in the physical world. And that would be a severe limitation. And the third aspect of the problem is related to like death. So when is the soul decoupled from the
Yeah.
computer? It is when you stop the software. That's a bit too soon. It is when you delete the files where maybe they are there for
Yeah.
centuries, or when exactly. So maybe these three
Yeah. So
aspects.
maybe let's think about the death. So the death case is interesting because, okay, I'm running this piece of software and then I can just like pause all the operations on this computer and then maybe come back and restart them a year later, 2 years later, or maybe I'll just never get around to restarting it at all. So if there's like a soul associated with this machine, what happens to it? And I guess there are a few possibilities. One is like it stays in being and is like waiting in the wings, ready to interact with the physical system once press restart. The other is it like dies and does whatever souls do upon death, either it ceases to exist or like goes on to the next plane or whatever. But I think a parallel question arises in the human case. So these companies, I think Alcor is one of them, that will freeze your body or brain upon death. I think you can pay more to have the whole body frozen. You get the budget option and just have your brain frozen. And the thought is, well, we're going to keep your body/brain in a freezer for a long time, and hopefully in the future we'll develop the technology needed to like reanimate these bodies and brains. And we promise that we'll do that once the technology is here. And so people like pay a decent amount of money to be like cryogenically frozen in the hopes that they'll be technologically erected or reanimated one day. And I think you can ask the same question here. Like I don't even know what happens to the soul in these cases, but suppose like I've got some terminal illness, but like right before I would bodily die, I go into like the freezing chamber and then I'm put in the vault at Alcor. Is that for me? Or because like the body might be reanimated in 100 years once they develop the technology. And if my body is reanimated in 100 years, will it receive the same soul? Will it receive a new soul? Will it be like a soulless zombie? I think all the same questions arise in the biological case. So I don't know why this would be a special problem for AI ensoulment. I have somewhat parallel things to say about the other cases, but I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, so in general, I grant that all the issues that I argue arise in the AI case have parallel sci-fi adjacent versions in the human case. But the point is, fittingness comes in degrees, and I argue that so does integrity, and there's some nice correlation between the two. And I think because these scenarios are rampant in the case of machines and esoteric in the case of humans, the point still stands that there's a great difference in degree of integrity and degree of fittingness.
I see. Yeah. So I definitely agree that we have here a difference in degree. But that's, yeah, what I want to claim is there's not a difference in kind. I mean, just real quick following up. So I think in the kind of fission cases where, it's really easy in practice to get fission cases for AI systems because you can just like duplicate the exact code and run it on another computer. And then you can ask all the familiar questions from the personal identity literature of like what happens after fission to the original person. But as you can cook up scenarios like this in the biological case. In some cases, they're more sci-fi. So like Parfit has this case where like you split my brain along the corpus callosum and you take one hemisphere. Like we normally think like the survival of one hemisphere is enough for the survival of the person, because like if one hemisphere of my brain just stops functioning altogether, but the other one stays healthy, then intuitively I survive, maybe with somewhat degraded capacities, but it's still me. And like other hemisphere. But then what happens if you like split my hemispheres and you put one in one body and another in another body? You can ask what happens to the original person, and it's totally unclear what the answer is. But that's a relatively, I guess, a sci-fi case. But there's non-sci-fi cases having to do with twinning with monozygotic twins. I mean, this is sensitive to what you think about like when ensoulment happens, but suppose you think that ensoulment happens pretty early on, like at conception. Then in cases of twinning, there's a question. I mean, basically, we just have like a real life fission case. Like the zygote receives the soul, and then 2 weeks later, you've got this like blastocyst that splits into two and then develops into two identical twins. And you can ask, what's going on with that original soul? Does maybe like there's a single soul that's now animating two bodies? So your friends who are identical twins actually share a soul. Okay, that's kind of weird. Or maybe the soul like arbitrarily chooses to go with twin A rather than twin B. That's kind of weird because, why did it choose A rather than B, rather than vice versa? That's arbitrary. Or maybe the original soul like dies and two new souls come into being. That's probably the least arbitrary, but it's also a little bit weird because that would suggest that like when you find out that like your wife is pregnant with identical twins, then that's also discovering that basically like a miscarriage occurred and that there was a death. And so, that doesn't fit our normal emotional reactions. Okay, none of these are like knockdown objections to any of the options, but certainly like the questions arise in that case. And that's not a sci-fi case. That's a real life case that happens like one every few hundred pregnancies. Is your response similar here that yes, this can happen, but there's still a significant difference of degree? Is that the thought?
I mean, yeah. I mean, so if if ensoulment happens at conception, then this kind of puzzling case happens like once in the lifetime of one in several hundred people. For an AGI, it could happen every day.
Potentially.
Yeah, so I think that's a massive difference. And I don't want to establish anything more than a difference in degree because I think the fitting recipient argument is an argument about degree. I mean, that's why we never expect that the table or my laptop with just Windows running on it to become ensouled.
Yeah.
The whole thing is a matter of degree, I think, and the best I can do is argue that there is significant difference in degree.
Yeah. One thought I had when thinking about this argument was it seems to make fittingness weirdly sensitive to whatever kind of technological conditions prevail at the time. So suppose in a few hundred years, we do have the technology to create all these weird sci-fi fission kinds of cases with human beings, of the sort that's in the personal identity literature. And suppose that we're like using these technologies all the time. So, teleportation and brain transplants and all the rest. It seems to suggest that like if we reach the technological conditions where we are creating these fission scenarios with human beings as often as we are with computers, then all of a sudden like human biological bodies are relative to those conditions just as unfitting to receive souls as AGI. But I guess I would think like whatever the basic laws of ensoulment are, or whatever like God's policies are for like when he's going to create and infuse a soul, bestow it on a material system, I would be surprised if they are like sensitive to where we're at in technologically. It shouldn't be like that contingent on historical circumstances.
Yeah, I agree with that. And what I would say, and what I do say in the paper, is behind this objection lies two different conceptions of integrity. One is counterfactual, as in what would happen if put into various circumstances, and that changes with the circumstance, right? What the nearest possible worlds are like. The other is dispositional, which I maintain should be understood as supervening on the intrinsic properties of the system.
Mm-hmm.
And so my point is, for a few reasons, one of which is that's how all the other natural laws work. We should imagine the relevant version of integrity to be put in dispositional terms, and therefore it's only the intrinsic aspects of the structure that are relevant, and what technologies are around us aren't.
Mm-hmm.
And the intrinsic features of a computer and a biological nervous system are very different.
Yeah. different in this particular way that
Yeah.
allowing for easy decoupling of software and hardware.
Yeah, I mean, I have a bachelor's degree in computer science, and what they really taught us was the von Neumann architecture in the design of computers, the great innovation that allowed for programming machines, which is based on the fundamental principle is separating the executing part and the memory part, and the memory part stores the program. And therefore, you can change that all the time, and that's transferred to execution separately, and whatever happens in the executing part is contingent on what people put in the memory part. There's nothing like that in our nervous system.
This is a computer science question where I don't have much expertise at all. Is that still true with modern GPUs that are used in like large language models? Because I've read that GPUs are kind of designed, optimized at the hardware level to, compute these like linear algebra functions that you need to pass activation levels to different nodes in the network. And that makes it sound like there's more of a harmony between the software and the hardware. But
Yes, so to the best of my knowledge, it's still that principle that's being used. There is research on so-called neuromorphic engineering, so creating machines inspired by the way our brains work, and so they would have not memory and execution, but so-called memoristors, which is a combination of memory and transistor, and that imitates how neurons learn. So if we manage to build a machine out of billions of memoristors like this, so that the only difference relative to a neural network, like a biological neural network, would be the atoms that make it up, I would be much more open to ensoulment. But I don't think that's typically how we think of AGI.
I'll make one further point, I guess, on your side of the debate, which has to do with these personal identity issues, but from a slightly different angle. So one reason I thought why it might be unfitting for AI systems to receive souls, it has to do with the to veridically remember first personal events. So this starts with your assumption that there's going to be all sorts of wonky stuff with personal identity as we kind of copy the code and make variations run on different instances of the program, run on different hardware. And now we can think what that would imply for the system's first personal memories. So suppose it did receive like consciousness or a soul or whatever, and it remembers having done such and such in the past while it was on some different piece of hardware. But suppose that, that was in fact like a different person, a different soul that was responsible for that prior event. Then basically you'd get a situation where almost all the Daisei or first personal memories of these systems are non-veridical. And you could at least argue that's a sense in which they're less fit recipients. Like, one thing that makes the human body a fit recipient for the soul is that it can facilitate veridical beliefs and perceptions and memories and so forth about the world and the environment. And that might not be true for AI systems if they're kind of like indefinitely copied and buried and so forth in these ways.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, assuming that memories are not stored in the soul, but in the body. But I do think that's plausible.
Yeah, I find that pretty plausible, at least for a wide range of memories.
This was fun. I got to sit back and listen to you all exchange thoughts. So let me see if I'm getting the main point so far. Because I think Balint had a final reply that I didn't quite understand. So I want to make sure I get this before we move. So the basic thought was, with respect to the fitting recipient argument, there needs to be this additional condition of what makes something a fitting recipient, and that is integrity. I'm just curious, Brian, I could say more, I could summarize more, but do you agree with that? Do you agree that there needs to be this extra condition on what would be a fitting recipient? Because when you all were talking about difference in degrees, like maybe you're very likely to be a fitting recipient if you have integrity. But if you don't, it may not be that you aren't a fitting recipient. It's just you're not as fitting a recipient. That's what I understood the degree's point to be saying. But am I understanding? Is that fair? I guess I'm asking you, Brian, about the integrity condition. Is that actual essential? And I don't know that Balin's even saying it is essential to be a fitting recipient. It gets murky here when we talk about
I don't really know. When in the paper, I was mainly thinking of fitting recipients in terms of whether the physical system has like structure and physical capacities that allow it to meaningfully cooperate with the operations of the soul. So does it have a behavioral repertoire that can meaningfully express and reflect the internal states of the soul? Does it have internal states that model the environment that can serve as causal inputs to the sensory operations of the soul? Does it have something, analogous to something that can structurally facilitate reasoning of, the reasoning or rational processes of the soul? Those were the main things I had in mind. Integrity is a bit different. I guess I can see how that would add to the fittingness of receiving a soul in some sense. I do think, once we're thinking of fittingness as a matter of degree, which is fair, I mean, fittingness is a matter of degree, then it seems to me that even if we agree that integrity is one factor that contributes to degree of fittingness and that it's not there in the AI case, it could be that other factors are there in compensating quantities such that, like, all things considered, it has at least as much fitness to receive a soul as a human being. And I think this is plausible if you think of cases like, well, maybe like very undeveloped human beings, like babies, or human beings with significant neural defects, like certain kinds of severe mental disability. The like lack of development or severe neural defects would lessen the degree of fitness in the sense that I'm talking about. But presumably we think that the baby and the severely mentally disabled person nonetheless has a soul. So that suggests that like the required degree of fitness maybe is not particularly high. And then we go over to the AGI case where in certain respects it'd be more fit than the baby or the severely mentally disabled person. In other respects, namely this integrity respect, it's less fitting, but kind of overall it's at least as fitting as in some of these marginal cases. So I don't know.
On the babies and developmental issues thing, I think a better solution is what actually Brian says in one of his footnotes, which is to say that once the organism is sort of has this natural potential to develop into a creature with the right kind of fittingness, or it's like on a developmental pathway, this is my phraseology, to become such a creature that should, to accommodate our intuitions, we should think that's kind of sufficient. But I don't think that a system that has no prospects of increasing its fittingness and has as low a fittingness as a like a disabled baby, I'm not sure that's the right thing. Also, to get back on the case of how does integrity contribute to fittingness, you could say it's just a factor. It can add 0.2 or detract 0.2 or something. I mean, in my paper, I suggest that maybe it sets an upper bound on the fittingness of a system that's stronger. I don't know. I feel like once I get into the perspective of thinking about how many things we could do to these pieces of software, it seems like it just makes no sense for a software like that to grant ensoulment. But once we start thinking about all these adjacent cases and whatever might happen to humans, I don't want to say really.
I'm curious if earlier I mentioned the alien analogy where we encounter these seemingly intelligent aliens, and even though they differ from us at the low level material constitution, if they're behaving, we'd be inclined to say that they have souls, assuming we do. But suppose we vary the case such that we find some kind of lack of integrity of the sort that you're focused on. So We find, even though we're inclined to call them like living things, there is a strong amount of like decoupling between their.
So we just meet robots?
Yeah, I wasn't imagining them as stereotypical robots. I don't have anything very in mind. I mean, you can imagine them kind of soft and squishy in a stereotypically biological way, but nonetheless, there is this kind of decoupling aspect wherein the kind of within their nervous systems can be transitioned onto other hardware. Maybe that's how they like communicate. It's not by transferring neural signals into speech, but rather there's some kind of like radio communication wherein they can directly transfer like files within their nervous system onto other brains or something like this. Does that, if that's what we found when we dissected them, would you think, yeah, probably they don't have souls. Probably these are just mindless automata.
I feel like it would depend on the details. So like imagine we find something, a creature like this, and we dissect it and it's an ordinary
Yeah.
computer. Then I would think it has no soul. You want to say it's not exactly like that, but then I want to say it depends on the details. So I'm not sure. I also think if we found a computer in there, that would be also an evidence that it's an artifact. And I don't know how that relates exactly to this. I mean, I don't want to claim that it's a requirement on ensoulment that it be a biological creature, because you criticize that well in your paper. But I do think being a biological creature correlates with integrity somehow, because of how evolution works, I suppose. It's more likely to produce creatures with high integrity, while artifacts are less likely to have high integrity. So I think there's some connection there.
Is that true, though? I mean, so in the case of computers, von Neumann architecture is explicitly designed to have this pretty sharp software-hardware distinction. But with other artifacts like watches or whatever, I don't know, would maybe this is just to clarify your notion of integrity. Would you say that a watch has integrity? I mean, you can distinguish the low-level mechanical, physical features of it from the higher-level functions, but they seem to be deeply connected. You couldn't just kind of like transfer the high function onto some new piece of hardware in a straightforward way.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of that in that it's easier to turn off and on than a human. But maybe what I said was too strong, yeah.
It sounds like, well, Bala, you actually mentioned 3 things. The first was integrity. The second had to do with being embodied. And then the third had to do with death. Do you recall mentioning those 3?
I guess I wanted to say that all of these are parts of integrity. No, all of these are parts of fittingness, aspects of fittingness. And all of them are such that computers are less fitting in these respects because they have less integrity. So think about bodies. A physical system is fit to have a soul because it gives the soul a reliable way to be present in the physical world, in the sense it provides a body for the soul. But if the soul ends up being dragged along into all kinds of computers all the time, then it doesn't have this stable access to the world. But that's because it has low integrity and it's easy to move it around.
We spent a lot of time thinking about like death cases, turning it off, turning it on, moving it around, or well, that sort of thing. Did we have any with respect to like specifically being embodied that we think would be useful to discuss here?
I'm good.
So Brian, you gave examples. I'm thinking like in the death cases, you had human analogs. They were like, oh, well, think about this case and think about this case. With respect to being embodied, do you have any like human analogs or something that you would want to, that you think would be relevant here?
Well, I guess it depends a little bit on how we cash out embodied. If it's, being such that you can kind of like have motor control over a body, then you might want to think about cases of total paralysis or locked-in syndrome or things like that. But ultimately, well, I guess I have a couple of thoughts about embodiment. One is, if you think embodiment is a really important fittingness condition, then fine. but you'll just want to consider kind of like robotically embodied AI systems. Then we could have an argument as to whether kind of the sense in which like a robot is embodied is relevantly different from the sense in which we are embodied. But if it's just a matter of like fittingness requires that there be some kind of like a motor control over some thing with like limbs and so forth, and maybe there's kind of sensory input from the environment, then yeah, like you could get that in the AI system when it's robotically embodied. I have doubts about whether any kind of is required for ensoulment. Partly because there's some operations of the human soul that like sensory operations and motor operations and so forth that essentially require bodies, but there are some operations that don't clearly essentially require embodiment in any straightforward way. And so potentially there could be like a kind of soul that is fittingly received by a non-embodied AI system. I think it's hard to know, but I do think the embodiment issue is less central because it's likely that we will have future AI systems that are embodied in some relevant sense. This is an interesting issue. So I'm not sure this is true. So I can have like a unified set of goals and projects that are usefully served by kind of taking on one body in Indiana today and another body in New York tomorrow and then Beijing the next day. In a way, this is a lot of people's work life is like this if they have to travel a lot and perform a lot of like functions for their job that all contribute towards some like unified goal. So you can imagine an AI system that instead of getting on the plane to go to Beijing today and Tokyo tomorrow, New York the next day, is just kind of like transfers the file onto, kind of assumes control of like a different robotic body in these different places. And, today they're controlling a robotic body in America. Tomorrow they're controlling a robotic body in China. But all of their actions kind of contribute towards like a unified goal that's like whatever their job is. That doesn't, that's an alien way to be in some sense, but that doesn't strike me as a totally awful way to be. It's not a particularly human way to be, but yeah, so I get the point that like, you don't want like a totally fragmented life, but I'm imagining like, no, there is a kind of unified agency. All their operations are aimed at a certain unified set of goals in something like the way that human beings are. It's just that to serve those goals, it makes sense to control. And maybe they're like occupying radically different kinds of bodies. Like here they're operating a forklift directly, and here they're operating like a tentacled weird octopus robotic body, and here they're operating like an Amazon robot. But that could all kind of be expressions of a unified mental life that's aimed at a unified set of goals.
I guess my impression so far is I think I understand the main objection that Volent is raising, and it doesn't just apply to the fitting recipient argument. It's almost like the alien analogy argument depends to some extent on what you say about what makes something fit to be a recipient of a soul. I might be misunderstanding that, but it seems like if the integrity condition is really required, or at least makes ensoulment like more likely to happen, I guess, then to the extent that an alien has integrity, then sure, it would be ensouled. But to the extent that an alien doesn't have integrity, it would not be ensouled, or it's less likely to be ensouled. I guess I'm pretty sympathetic with what Brian's been these analogies that Brian's been raising. It seems like in many ways you can offer a kind of parody in the human case, and it looks like in each of those cases, ensoulment, you don't want to deny that it's not likely that the human has a soul. Thank you both for doing this, and I will make sure that both of the papers are linked in the description, as well as the previous interview that I did with Brian where he unpacked his paper in more detail. All right, thanks. Thank you both.